I'm Jennifer Copp, and I'm pleased to be here with Dr. Peggy Giordano at the 2014 meetings of the American Society of Criminology in San Francisco. And I'm going to be interviewing Peggy a little bit about her career and history and how she got to where she is today. So first, I'll start with a little bit of background. Peggy received her BA in sociology from the University of Missouri in 1970. From there, she went on to the University of Minnesota to complete her graduate work, earning her PhD in sociology in 1974. And then that same year, she joined the faculty at Bowling Green State University, where she remains to this day. Mm-hmm. She's published extensively on a range of topics, including delinquency and social influence processes, desistance, intergenerational transmission, and more recently, intimate partner violence, and we'll have her talk a little bit about these different bodies of work. She's spearheaded multiple data collection efforts and is currently conducting a longitudinal study looking at the relationship experiences of a large group of individuals who were first interviewed as adolescents and then subsequently as they transitioned to adulthood. She's received numerous accolades for her published work. She was appointed Distinguished Research Professor at Bowling Green in 2000 and was named a Fellow of the American Society of Criminology in 2006. So just sort of a brief portrait of what she's been doing over the years. And so I guess to get started, if you could talk a little bit about how you became a criminologist, maybe starting with your undergraduate work and then moving on from there.
Well, thanks, Jennifer. Yes, so I think one of the things that's a little different about my becoming a criminologist is that my undergraduate work was very important for that. And so I was a Spanish major and just sort of thinking about now, what am I going to do with Spanish? And I do like to speak Spanish, but I'm not so sure that I want to teach 19th century literature and things like that. But I then had the good fortune to become a work-study student in the Department of Sociology at the University of Missouri. And so I worked there, and that was a revelation to me because I got a real first-hand look at what professors are actually doing and how they're teaching, but also in there doing their writing, doing their research, talking about it with each other. And I was just fascinated with that, and it was kind of a bird's eye view of that for the first time. And so there were all these sociologists, and I used to just talk to them, and I think they thought that I might have been a little bit odd because I was so interested in all the different things that they were doing. So it wasn't necessarily criminology was the way, from the beginning. But there was one professor there, John Gallagher, who is a criminologist, and he was great, not only in some of this informal chats about what he was working on, but there came a time when he decided he wanted to have undergraduates help him with his research. And so he got probably a half dozen students together, of which I was one, and we were supposed to go out into our own towns where we were from and do research on the police. And so up until that time, I had not been interested in crime or the police or anything of that nature. But I thought that sounded really fun and exciting, that we would ride along in the police cars. We were going to be paid for this, which was amazing, that this was going to be the summer job to replace my factory jobs that I'd had for the last 2 summers. And so I was so incredibly excited. So I went back to my town, which was a small suburb of St. Louis, and I had to get permission, as all of my other undergraduate colleagues did, to get permission to ride in these cars. And so I met with the city council, and they said, no, you cannot ride in the cars. And so I was just devastated because this was so fun and so exciting. And so I was very upset, but what I decided to do was that I would do a less than perfect methodological strategy of following them in my own car. And so I would start at the start of their day and the second shift, and I would start in the parking lot, and I would just follow them along in my black little VW Bug of the era. in the 60s, and I would just follow them slowly along as much as I could. And this wasn't an ideal methodological strategy because sometimes they would then just take off and leave me in the dust. But, this went on for quite some time. And they would look back and they'd be, they were aware that I was there.
Mm-hmm.
And so
was the city council aware that you were doing this?
I don't think the city council was aware that I was doing it, but they were very aware. And so then it sort of morphed into where they would go to Steak and Shake or Chuck a Burger, where you had trays, where you were sat outside, and we would talk over the trays and talk about things. And so they got used to me, and they got to where they kind of liked me. And so then they would wait for me, or they would tell me where they were going. And they would go on a domestic call, or they would go somewhere, and if they had to go fast, they would just scream, Pizza Hut or whatever it was, and I would meet them. And so that whole summer, I worked with the police, but I have to say, they never let me in that car. They let me say something over the mic once to one of their friends, but never got in the car. But I would sit out in the grass and watch them ticket people. And I would get to ask them questions about, this middle-aged couple, you let them go with a warning, but here the next guy that looked like a hood, you're ticketing him, what's up with that? Why the difference in treatment? And so I just love the whole research process, and that was it for me. I thought, this is great. And then we came back to Missouri, and all of this, some of them got in the cars. I never did, but we all talked about factors that are associated with decision making by the police, and how extra legal factors matter or don't matter. And it was just tremendously exciting for me. And so that was my first foray into it. And I would have to say John Gallagher was a great mentor for me. And one of the things he did that I think gives you a feeling of what an undergrad experience I had was that I had roommates that made a lot of noise constantly, and they it was hard to study in there. And so there came a time when I was writing up all the results of my research on the police there, this fabulous study. And so he actually put a little table in his office.
Oh, wow.
And there were lots of times when he wasn't there where he would let me use his office. And so, of course, it had all these criminology books in it. Free, no need to go to the library. And I just felt like the big old professor there at the age of 19 or 20. And so that was, I think, a wonderful start. And then the other part, I think, that was influential for me was that at Missouri there was a big tradition of symbolic interaction, and I had courses with Robert Habenstein, and so there was the whole Chicago school symbolic interaction emphasis. And so I was thinking about that and thinking, well, in a certain way I haven't learned anything, since then, because I got the exposure to the symbolic interactions perspective, which I seem to be carrying forward in many different studies, and that sort of love of criminology, and maybe combine those two things in my work. But definitely the University of Missouri was a really big starting influence.
Right. Which, as you mentioned, is somewhat unique. Most people
it is a little different, I think.
Yeah. So then how did you end up deciding on graduate school? Was it thanks to that same professor? And why did you end up at the University of Minnesota?
Yeah. So I don't think when you're that age you really know that much about departments and what they're really like. It's kind of crazy in a way how to decide. Certainly I thought about the University of Chicago just because of that tradition. And I mean, to be honest, I got the application, and it was intimidating to me because they asked all these questions like, what journals do you read on a routine basis? And I'm thinking like, Mademoiselle, Time Magazine, and, no knowledge of even the journal name or anything. And so I kind of abandoned that as over my head. But I thought that Minnesota had a guy there named Harold Finestone, who was also, kind of in that same tradition and had done some gang work. And he was also very much in the spirit of the symbolic interactionist perspective. And so that was probably the reason. And as so many things happen in careers, I didn't end up working with him, and he wasn't really my mentor per se, but I had coursework with him that was very valuable, and I just thought he was terrific. And so, but that was probably the reason. And yeah, so then I actually began to work with John Clark, who was at the University of Minnesota, and he had this big project that I worked on the whole time I was there. There were probably 6 graduate students, and it was actually a study of different agencies that handle problem youth within 8 different cities. So it was a big project, and it was about complex organizational processes and how that influences coordination of services. And I have to say, I had absolutely no interest in that whole project. And I think that's kind of interesting too, because here I was on a project that at one level I wasn't that interested in it, but it was enormously helpful. It was wonderful to work with a team, got a lot of good experience. I could see how funded projects work and how they come to fruition. I got to travel to different cities to interview judges and probation officers, and I just thought that was wonderful. And again, Clark was very supportive of what I wanted to do. So I think in that case, since I wasn't really interested in, interorganizational coordination in the delivery of human services, I took a different tack with my dissertation, and I looked at how juveniles themselves understood those different parts of the system. And that's what my dissertation was on, is how did they experience the police, and how did they experience judges and probation officers and others in the system. And so it was, kind of in the back door, getting that sense of the meanings of it from their point of view. And so I think I learned a lot, but it wasn't exactly that I would then go on and do work in complex organizations, because I never did.
But probably your participation in that project helped you in the future as you've built these larger projects that you've worked on over the years.
Right, how you actually move something from a grant all the way through, that did help a lot, and how timing goes with trying to get a grant in, and those kinds of nitty-gritty things about research.
What about other influences on your career? So in addition to people you've worked with directly, what about influences from the literature or maybe some of your contemporaries?
Right. So, well, as I came to Bowling Green, I guess I started to get interested in female delinquency. And so that was my first foray into a new direction. So I had that dissertation work, but I knew I didn't want to stick with that for a long time. And so there was very little on female delinquency. And that was something that I had written a small paper when I was a graduate student, so never throw those papers away. But so I knew that was something I didn't know anything about. And so I guess if I had to talk about my personal way of entering a research project, it would be that I like to, especially when I'm completely ignorant, as I was in that point in my life, I felt that I needed to talk to female delinquents. I mean, and that's always how I start a project. And so I went down to the State Institution for Girls, and in those days you didn't even get human subjects permission and things like that. You just kind of got permission from the correctional facility, and I talked to the heads of the facility, some of the staff, and I talked to young women there, and that kind of gave me the mojo to get it started. And so I would say that was more important to me than really what was in the literature at that time, because there really wasn't very much.
Right.
And the literature that was out there was kind of very stereotypical, as though girls are all about relationships and boys are about independence and acquisition and making something of themselves. And there was kind of these two themes, and then there was also the bad boyfriend theme, that anytime a girl's going to be involved, it's going to be through the bad boyfriend, which there is some truth to that. I don't want to say it's completely not true, but it just seemed overly broad. And so that got us started on a project that led to several funded projects on female delinquency. And one thought I had about that early time was that I called NIMH one time because Charles McKay, who was in our department, and he was a former treasurer actually of the ASC, so he was a great criminologist, and people have used his textbooks right along and so on. But there came a time when he asked me if I'd be interested in doing a project on auto theft. And so I thought, I was a first year assistant professor, and I thought, okay. And so then we decided we'll call NIMH and see if they're interested in funding this project. So I decided I'll call, and I remember calling the guy and asking him, we're doing this project on auto theft, do you have an interest? And there was just complete and utter silence. There was just, it was just like a dead phone. Are we even speaking? And so no interest in that. And so just as a kind of a throwaway, since I had been down interviewing these young girls and everything, I said, I'm really interested in female delinquency as well. Is there any interest in that? And he just lit up like a Christmas tree, and it was a completely different reaction. And so that was interesting to me. And and I thought, okay, if you're interested, let's roll, And then I started to talk with Steve Cernkovich, who became a very important colleague in this effort, and he was very good, very careful researcher, and he was interested as well. So we wrote the first grant on that, and then we wrote a series of different grants and began a bunch of different empirical papers on various facets of female delinquency. So, but I would have to say that entering each of these different projects, for the most part, I would start them off with some kind of interviewing rather than reading a book and saying, oh, I could do that, or I'm interested in that. Then later in the process, many different scholars became very important. So in the work on desistance, obviously Sampson and Lobb's work was very pivotal and very important, and studied that very carefully and so on. But
so let's move into your body of work then and start talking about, you have these different areas that you're well known for, so one of them being gender and crime, which you talked a little bit about the female delinquency, but could you talk a little bit more about these different areas of research that you have?
Sure. So the female delinquency has been interesting over time, and so I think that when we first started, Steve and I, we were just reacting to some of these stereotypes. And so we said, for example, the first time I taught delinquency, I was using a textbook. And in the textbook, it talked about how girls, there was a line, unlike boys, girls do not have rich same-sex peer groups to fall back on. And so that's one reason why they don't get involved in crime. And so I'm thinking, wait, I'm a girl, and, no rich same-sex peer groups to fall back on? Makes no sense. And so some of those basic understandings, it just didn't jive that much. And so we made sure that we included a lot about friendship in our protocol, and it did turn out that girls do kind of have rich same-sex peer groups to fall back on, and that they get involved in crime, that their peer associations also matter for them in whether they do become involved in crime or not. And so the peer delinquency piece of it is important for them as well. And so if I have to think about that, I could see that we marched through a number of different domains that had been studied with respect to boys. So family relationships, we did find, we found some nuances of difference across gender, but in the main, bad family. Delinquents are not people that come from the more nurturing two-parent family with lots of support and lots of control. So that's true for young women, and it's true for boys. And so we illustrated that Another one that we did, it was suggested that girls are feeling strained because of gender-based discrimination. And so we actually measured that directly. And we also looked at, though, feelings of blocked opportunities in a more general way. I'm the type of person that may not be able to get ahead in my career. I'm not likely to be able to go to college. And we found a lot more support for that general kind of feeling of blocked opportunity relative to, young women in the system are not necessarily feeling that they experience gender-based discrimination, although they may well have experienced it, but just at the experiential level of their own understandings and their own feelings about it. So that was one finding as well. So in my view, there are a number of areas of overlap in all these domains and how they influence female delinquency and how they influence male delinquency. But again, there came a time when that was not a popular point, and that it seemed to be that as the field developed, that the idea was that young women have completely different sensibilities and different focal concerns, different interests, and different sources of difficulty, and that we need a new theory that speaks to those different realities. And so it was funny to be on the other side where your work was kind of considered old-fashioned already, or out of touch or something, because in the beginning I thought that we were reacting against a stereotypical view about what girls were all about, and what their lives were like that may have led to or down a pathway that included delinquent behavior. So that's been an interesting journey as well, even getting into how do girls desist from crime, how do boys desist from crime, or women and men, and where the assumption might be that the pathways are quite different, but yet in our studies it doesn't appear to me that in a very fundamental or basic way they are all that different.
So
there's kind of a thread there that continues of resisting the idea of a complete bifurcation of theory, but recognizing that women's lives are not exactly the same as men's, for sure. So that for a variable like the delinquency of the partner or the criminal behavior of the partner, it actually is the case that women, if they have had problems with the law, they may be more likely to affiliate with a delinquent or criminal partner, but the nature of that association is quite similar. So if men happen to affiliate with a delinquent partner, that affects them, and it contributes variance to understanding their patterns of crime involvement. And it's the same for women. It's just that the base rates are quite different, and that's something that is very real as well.
So then how did that line of research then sort of transition into the research on your friendships and peers? And there's some research on female delinquency and their peer influences,
right,
and those sorts of things. So how did you then transition into the social network type research?
Yes, and so I have to say that over thinking about the career, that in many ways I'm kind of a knee-jerk social learning theorist, if you look at the different things. And conversely, I'd say that I'm sort of an anti-control theorist, or not a big fan of control theory, or certain features of it. Certain features of it I think are absolutely on point, and Hershey made a tremendous contribution in talking about these different forms of control and so on. But in certain aspects, namely in the friendship aspect, I just feel that wasn't accurate, and specifically got interested in that in a more general way. So it became not so much just about female delinquents and what their networks are like, but really the issue of how important is friendship and the friendship group to an understanding of the etiology of delinquency, which is a little bit more of a general question. And so as we developed our projects, it seemed clear that on the point of delinquent peer influence, that is where control theory and differential association theory completely diverge. And Hershey argued that delinquents have cold and brittle relationships with their friends. They're just loosely affiliated with them. And so that's important to know, because then it's impossible for those friends to really influence one another in the way that's implied by differential association theory. And so it became, I think, fairly easy to just try to measure, well, what are these relationships like? And so we included so many different items on friendship quality, friendship dynamics, and so on in our interview schedule. And Steve a lot of times used to get mad at me and say, well, this is not a friendship study, you know, we've got too many friendship items in here. And but we did have quite a few in the final versions. And so I think that the friendships and delinquency paper, that was an 86 paper, did show that you can't, they do not seem to be, more delinquent youth do not seem to be deficient in the basic features of their relationship in terms of feelings of caring, intimate self-disclosure, and other kind of basics that make people believe they have friends. And so that point was, in my view, not accurate. And so I think it's a good study in the sense of being able to publish something where you have absolutely no results. You know, there's no difference in a lot of the dimensions. And so that was quite the feat.
That focus on the nature and quality of friendships then is carried over into your work on romantic relationships, right?
Yes, and so there's been we have done this study of dating relationships, because that was another phase where it seemed as if when you study adolescent life, which I did, you know, for a long time, and I really loved the topic of peer relationships, but if you talk to young people, they're constantly talking about boyfriends, romantic relationships, sex. All those things are very exciting to them. And it was odd in a way, if you looked at the adolescence literature or even the delinquency literature, that there was so little on that, because the whole period is supposed to be defined by movement into these relationships. According to Harry Stack Sullivan, you know, that is the key defining feature of that phase of the life course. And yet when you look at adolescent psychology textbooks, they have a section on family, they'd have a section on peers, and then they'd have the sex chapter, as though the only utility of that person is whether or not you make the decision to have sex with them or incur that kind of risk. And so we started in about 1999 or 2000 and through there to think about dating relationships and their role in development. And I think that's just an example, as with the peer stuff, that I'm interested in what these relationships are like in a general way, and then some of the implications of that for more focused outcomes. And so we did show that the delinquency of the partner matters, and we did that through our studies, and we also did a study where we joined up with Dana Haney, which was fun because she was working with the Ad Health data set, and people like to have that the measurement of the actual partner delinquency.
Right.
And so Dana was able to analyze that and show, and we showed together that the delinquency of the partner mattered. And if you look at it in that way or in our more perceptual way, it also explains additional variance. And so, yes, the dating partner matters.
What about, so perhaps one of the areas that you're most well known for is your work on desistance. So how did that project start?
Okay, well, yes, so that project did not start as a desistance project. So Steve Sergovich and I had done these studies of female delinquency, and we had done neighborhood-based studies, and we had done more institutional studies. And the reason we did those institutional studies, it was almost like a little throwaway thing. We were not funded to do those, but we just felt kind of bad that when you do a neighborhood-based survey, you're really not getting that many female delinquents. And if we're saying we're studying female delinquency, how many real delinquent girls are we capturing through our 947 people in our youth survey here. So we just went down to the institution and interviewed the total population for girls, not, just we took undergraduates, and I can't even tell you to this day why we did it, except we just were sort of afraid, like we're not really getting at these girls. So we did that, and we had the comparable sample of boys at 3 male institutions. And so that was just kind of laying there for a while. And then we did a follow-up study of the neighborhood. How did these people turn out? And there was a time when Steve and I were just rambling and talking, and we said, I wonder if we could find those original institutionalized kids that were in the correctional facilities. And so we had no idea if we could find them or not. And we had extremely poor locating information, where they were giving us an address of their girlfriend that we could get in contact with her, which they probably weren't even friends anymore, and it had been 13 years with no contact. And yet we received a grant to follow them up and to try to find them. And so that was a very simple study, like, wonder whatever happened to those girls. So it wasn't a desistance study. It was just, how did they turn out? And sort of there was that question of whether the girls' lives, as they had transitioned into adulthood, would they have more or less gone on to lead fairly productive lives, or what had happened to them over the long haul. And so in a certain way, there was a fear that we might only find like 5 of them or something like that. I mean, we had no idea about that. And so we were able to find, I think it was almost 80% of them eventually, and they were scattered all around the state because they were statewide institutions. Mm-hmm. And so we did the initial follow-up of them when they were age 29. And that was the basis of the paper on cognitive transformations, because during that time, here comes Sampson and Lobb with this fascinating book in which they basically revitalized the field by thinking more long-term, by thinking life course, by coming up with their age-graded theory of informal social control and all the rest. And the book was just great. That was in 93 that book came out, and so we conducted that first follow-up in 95, and so we were heavily influenced by that in thinking about it. And yet things didn't fit seamlessly, so that so many of our women and men were not married. So many of them did not have employment, that you couldn't use the good marriage effect in a straightforward way to explain the variability that we could see there was still there. Some people were getting out, some people were doing better than others, but yet these transition events were not always the source of that variability. And so that led us to thinking more about subjective factors and internal sources of change and the like. And I have to say that that's a project where, of all the different things that I've worked on, I felt that there were very few decisions that I actually made in that study that I felt that the data were actually telling me what to do and how to behave, not to be new age or anything like that. But it was very easy to do it because the data were sort of falling into different hooks for change, like what are the sources of change, whatever. I felt that I didn't have that much to do with it. I was just more or less trying to be a faithful reporter of this.
But was that largely based on their narratives then? I mean, as someone who's worked with you, you're very intuitive and can sit down with these narratives from the qualitative interviews and sort of build a story from that. So were those sort of narratives really influential for that piece of work?
Yes. The narratives were very pivotal, totally. And but I always believe in quantitative information too, because you can get the wrong idea. So just to give this current example, in our narratives of how do people move away from intimate partner violence, a lot of them will mention their children. I've got to do better for the kids. It's all about the kids. My kids deserve better. So if you would just read that at face value, you would think that children is the main hook for change that gets people away from these unhealthy intimate partner violence situations. Then when you do these hierarchical general linear models, which I can say I didn't perform myself, but others did, then you see that isn't systematically related to desistance at all. And in fact, having children is positively related to intimate partner violence or no difference. And so you really can, I think you need both things. If you have access to them, you can ill afford to ignore that quantitative piece. But yet the narratives, I spent a long time with them. And I think that might be something that is different or a little bit strange about my process of doing research, is that I think that I spend an inordinate amount of time with them before I start coding or doing any kinds of things that people normally say would be science. Mm-hmm. And a lot of times reviewers want you to talk about your process and tell about all the many scientific blind coding schemes that you developed and things like that. And the reality for me is just trying to be open and not move in there with the coding scheme before you let the data tell you what it wants to tell you. I mean, and again, that sounds kind of dumb, but I spent a very long time with those and gave myself the luxury. At that point, I don't believe I was funded or anything like that. So I gave myself the luxury of just allowing myself to enjoy. I mean, because some of them had terrible lives and it wasn't enjoyable in that sense, but to just enjoy the process and be open to that process. And I would spend a lot of time with the women's narratives and ignore the men, then say, okay, what can I learn shifting over to the men, or just look at all the things that had to do with marriage and partnerships, not anything else. And so it was a really long drawn out process, but it did seem as if I did not develop a sheet that had, these are the steps I need to take. It was like the data were kind of leading by the hand.
So when you decided to do this follow-up, was it sort of just to try and figure out where those women were, or did you always have this idea that you were going to try and follow up with some of the children as well?
No, so we had no interest in following up those children, not at all. So the first follow-up was just, how are these young people, they would be 29, how was their transition to adulthood? And of course, it was a litany of horrors. That's what we found in 1995, 96. It was bad. Mm-hmm. And they were inhabiting some of the worst housing situations. They were heavily involved in crack cocaine use, a lot of them. There was homelessness. There was living in cars. There were a lot of very dire situations there. And so in the midst of all that, there were young kids sort of crawling around mom, or they were talking about the fact that they did not live with one or more of their children, and it was impossible to ignore the children and to wonder about what is happening with their development as well. But it was kind of a backdoor thing at that point. We weren't really fully invested in those children at that point. And at the early interview, they were still very hopeful. There was a lot of hope in the 29-year-old type interviews that this kid, he could be president of the United States, he could really be something, and he'd be 8 or something like mm-hmm. that. And so you didn't get a sense of what developed. And so then the next follow-up we did was to look at the children's well-being more carefully, and to look at the parenting aspect. And that was in 2003, I think. And the kids then were on average teens, mm-hmm. and we got them if they were, probably 10 up through. Sometimes we just felt that we had to interview somebody if they were even outside of our teen age range, because it was just so devastating and they were part of the family. And some of those older children maybe had the worst of it because they were born when the person was most actively involved in criminal activity or drug use or something. So we did reach up there to age 21 and things as well.
Okay. And so then from speaking with the children, you sort of got some insight into how this process of intergenerational transmission might work, or
right.
how did, because as you mentioned, this follow-up initially, it was more focused on distance,
right.
but then this book
right. And so then we had the task of interviewing these children, and sometimes we interviewed every child that was in that family. And so I guess there's a couple points about the intergenerational transmission study that might be of interest or make a small contribution. And so one of the points that we felt from getting this, again from the point of view of the child, was that there's been a lot of recent interest in mass incarceration effects and the negative effects of incarceration on children, and even maternal incarceration. So we had people who had experienced the incarceration of mothers as well as fathers. And so our view from the point of view of the child was that often the larger lifestyle, the broader package of risks, the ongoing life course experiences that they had were much more devastating, much more unrelenting, much more up close and personal, much more problematic than the specific period of the parents' incarceration. And so that became a little bit of a theme. I don't know if it's got any, I don't think it's out there in the field too much, but that was something that I felt, at the very minimum, when individuals are doing their studies of incarceration effects, they absolutely need to try as well as they can to get those measures of the antisocial behavior of the parent. That's not to say that the incarceration period doesn't further marginalize kids and the family as a whole. And I wouldn't say incarceration is good. Incarceration does something wonderful. It doesn't. But it's just all part of a package that's really difficult to tease apart. So that was one thing. And then the other sort of part of that interested us is, what is intergenerational transmission? What are the mechanisms that are driving intergenerational transmission? And so it seemed to me that the field really hasn't gotten too far on that, because usually people will say that if there is intergenerational transmission, it's the direct modeling idea, mom's violent, I'm violent, in kind of a straightforward way, or through inadequate parenting practices. And so that the pathway would be lower supervision, because the parent is debilitated or elsewhere or whatever. And so those are the direct transmission idea of modeling, or indirectly through lower supervision kinds of things. And so in the book, we tried to talk about many different other ways in which there could be pathways to negative outcomes for the children. So one of the pathways would be an emotional reaction to these family circumstances. And so a lot of the kids felt, they, on the one hand, this life that they have is normal, and it's normal to them, and maybe a lot of their relatives have had similar experiences. But on the other hand, they have exposure to other families where it isn't like that. They know. And so there is a bit of reaction, like, why is my mom stumbling when she's coming to pick me up in the car, and I'm here with my friends, and I'm just so embarrassed because she's high right now, or whatever it may be, or why is this happening to me? Why would she steal from me? Why would she do that? You don't steal from your son. And so I think the emotional, that goes along with maybe Agnew's notion of anger as a mediator, but that is where you have, the idea that they don't start out that way, they don't want to be that way, they don't want to be like their parents, and there comes a kind of like screw it moment where they're like, this is not working and it's not fair, so I'm just going to go out myself and do what I want to do, which may include getting high myself. And then also, so that was one sort of mechanism that I thought hadn't been fully elaborated on, is the emotional aspect. And then the other point that I think is in the book Legacies is that we often focus on a one-for-one sort of modeling. That if I'm interested in the violence of the child, then I'm focusing on the violence of the mother and how that transmits. But, or this one has crime, that one has crime. But actually, families, most of the time, nobody is doing crime all that much. And I think the early stuff on gangs made that point very clearly. Like, most of the time, the guy in the gang is not doing delinquency or violence. Mm-hmm. They're doing all this round of other things that constitute a life. Right. And so these families are communicating, and the parents are communicating about a lot of other things that are not directly crime. So they're providing definitions, but it's not, strictly speaking, definitions favorable to the violation of law. But it might be negative attitudes toward teachers. So we had people in our sample where there's a case where one young woman came home because she got in some kind of an altercation with the teacher, and then nobody treats my daughter that way, and she goes up, and instead of saying, well, now the teachers are somebody that you need to respect, she went and actually she did beat up the teacher. So in that case, it was kind of a one-for-one. But in general, there is some distrust of authority figures, for example. A lot of what we saw also had to do with the development of gender mistrust, or you can't trust the opposite sex. And so you think, well, what's that got to do with crime? Well, it's not to do with crime directly, but as people move forward and they develop these relationships, it makes sense that this could affect their stability in the kinds of relationships that would ever produce the good marriage effect, because they're not learning about relationships being a benign, safe place for you. They're learning that they may be dangerous, or whatever the case may be, that they're not, you can't trust your partner, and then they may move into relationships and carry that sort of baggage or set of attitudes with them. And it's not, strictly speaking, a pro-violence attitude, right, but it affects the character of the kinds of relationships that would have pro-social potential and keep that from happening. And the same with school, and many different kinds of attitudes that don't spell school success as well.
Yeah, I mean, that's a thread that's carried through a lot of your work, that these things that aren't necessarily directly related are in fact related, and you have a lot of good examples of that in the book, like the one you mentioned with the teacher, and also some things about, someone comes home from school and mom opens a 40 or dad, those sorts of examples where it's not directly related but is in fact
right related. So that they might learn from the mother or father that this is a stressful day, and so I'll open a 40-ounce beer, and that's how I do stress and coping in my family. And so then when they move forward in their own stressful situations, that's something that they know how to do.
And so that most recently you've been doing a lot of work on intimate partner violence. So how did that start? How did that evolve from these other projects?
Right. So when we started our dating study, and I work with Wendy Manning, who's a demographer, and Monica Longmore, who's a social psychologist. And so this is a bit of a broader project, so it's not just criminology world. But I think at that time, we were just trying to understand what are dating relationships like. And so we weren't setting out to do a study of intimate partner violence by any means. And so we did a number of basic studies that I think had implications for intimate partner violence. And so we thought, okay, why not study this directly? So, for example, one of the basic findings from that study is that as we interviewed people across 5 waves of interviews, we found that on average, males report lower levels of power in their relationship relative to their female counterparts, that is a relatively high percentage of couples report either egalitarian type relationships, or that the female has a slight advantage in terms of power, in terms of decision making in general, and in terms of specific domains of decision making. And we found that at the first wave of interviews when the kids were quite young. And so we thought, that doesn't go with a lot of statements in the literature about male power, male superiority, hegemonic masculinity, and so on. But that's what they're reporting to us. And the female reports were similar at the first wave. And we also found that males reported higher levels of partner control attempts relative to females. And so this also did not go along with sort of conventional wisdom, because there were some general studies, like general studies in gender development, that basically posited that when these two worlds meet, the world of young girls and the world of young boys, there was almost kind of a steamroller hypothesis that the boys would just roll in with their dominant interaction style that they'd accurately honed within their own male peer groups, and they'd kind of just flatten the selves of girls. And that girls wouldn't be used to this, and they had different style of interaction and so on. And so that I kind of I don't think I've ever written about that, but I think I call it the steamroller effect. And yet here they were at these early ages with different reports to us about the nature of those relationships, in which males were reporting high levels of partner control attempts, and the female reports are quite parallel. So then we thought, well, that's because they're young. That's because they're only talking about who's going to the football game, or things that are minor. So once they begin to mature and things take on a more weighty implications, that will start to shift, and we'll see that pattern change. And so now we've been through 5 waves of interviews, and the people are upwards of 29 years old in this study. And that's one of the things that happens when you get very old, is those people get to mature as well. And so as long as you could be propped up, they're continuing to age along with the investigator. And so they're still reporting higher levels of female control, a less favorable power balance, and so on. And so those are basic understandings. And I think if there's anything about my career approach or intellectual approach, it's I want to know what basic relationships are actually like, at least as a little bit of a foundation for moving into understanding these other more focused outcomes. And so, yes, so the Wave 5 interview, it was more focused on the problematic and on IPV in specific. And so we also found that same pattern exists in violent couples. So even though we have the dominant set of beliefs, and I think it is absolutely accurate for an important subgroup, across the sample as a whole, there's a lot of female control attempts, and female control is related to intimate partner violence reports. So we found, and actually you were involved in that study as well, so I'm not telling you anything you don't totally know, that control by male partners and control by the female partners, both of those contribute to variance in risk of IPV. And when you have specifically both, so they contribute in a traditional regression type format, but when you actually look at the various possible combinations, high levels of mutual control, where there's clearly instability and things are not settled, and there's high levels of male control and female control, that is the highest risk that we saw within our TAR sample.
Right.
So you can't necessarily just get all the way to where you want to go just thinking about male control. And it's difficult because we know that out there in real life, in some of the most difficult circumstances that are at the high end of seriousness, you have those intimate terrorists that really are exerting control, and the partner has very little degrees of freedom, and it isn't like that. But for a relatively high percentage of our violent couples, this other pattern seems to be very much in play.
But so obviously, as you mentioned, I was involved in this, so I know a little bit about the control aspect. But I think for a lot of people, it's hard for them to wrap their heads around how men and women could be equally controlling in a relationship. And so you have sort of a nuanced perspective on what these control attempts are and what they're trying to do in relationships.
Right. So I guess what we came to from looking at all these qualitative interviews that we did, because this study also has qualitative interviews attached with it, and so what we began to think is that it may be inaccurate to think that what people want in a relationship is a state of ultimate control. That their end game, what they really are trying to achieve, is just that. I want to be all powerful and all in control for its own sake. And so in our view, the way people talk anyway about their relationships is they're trying to control specific terrain, specific, tangible, concrete, contested areas within the relationship. And so that, who is this person that wants this ultimate control? Because I can assure you, it's not going to be a fun place to be if he's doing that just for its own sake, right, to be the dominant male. So it often revolves around specific, more localized areas of mismatch, I guess you'd say. And so we found 3 areas for this population of young people. And these are people that are in this period of emerging adulthood, which is quite popular right now, the transition, the emerging adult, the early adult. And so for these people, they mentioned three areas. And one did have to do with finances and economic issues, which kind of surprised us. And I know your dissertation goes into more detail on that. Thank you very much. But it's some of the people that are cohabiting, but even if they're not cohabiting, some of the issues around utilitarian interests made a difference. And people have different career aspirations. Some people, we're in a period here where it's not good economically. A lot of people are not getting the stable manufacturing jobs that the Glickman got and all the rest. And so they're sort of flailing around there. And so the area of financial and economic and where am I headed concerns is a source of some disagreements. And then the second area that we found was what we call the peers romantic partner mismatch. And that would be that if we think of this period as being the transition from a peer-based social life to one that includes significant commitment to a single partner, some of the disagreements have to do with how that's going, and perhaps one partner wants to spend more time with friends and not to be as invested in the relationship. And it sounds rather mundane, and well, how could that result in violence? But actually, a lot of these concerns are not just about a specific amount of time, a 2-hour time window. It's about what that means. And it means you don't want to spend time with me. And it means you may be at the bar, and it's just that not the 2 hours, it's the fact that you may be finding someone else while you're at the bar. And so it ultimately relates, that peer partner balance ultimately goes back to our third contested area that we find that it's as important, which is infidelity concerns. And so if I could only have one word, which I think I said in a panel yesterday, one word that would be infidelity is a key source of discord that is associated with violence. And there again, in terms of what people sort of think when they think about these violent situations, they are thinking about a male who has essentially apocryphal concerns and is jealous, and often that could be a trait-based kind of jealousy. Maybe they have attachment problems or whatever the case may be, and so they're just mindlessly jealous about this young woman who is their partner. But we find in the quantitative information and in the qualitative information that real infidelity, and specifically real infidelity of the male partner, is a big source of fighting and discord that leads to violence. And so it has a different arc. And the thing about it is, this coexists with some real cases within our study that do follow that traditional pattern of this crazy guy that's just so jealous he won't let anybody talk to his girlfriend and so on. But there's a quite a large percentage that do kind of follow along a different scenario. And I think it's interesting that a lot of prevention work and a lot of things that you see on websites, they only deal with the one scenario, and they don't deal with the sort of many different layers of difficulty and discord that we see in these data that may produce violence. And I think that's kind of a mistake, because what can happen is that if you present a prevention program where you say it's all about power and control, that's number one, and you depict it as a male's need to have ultimate power, they may not think they're that way, and they may say, well, my girlfriend's always trying to control me too. And they may think more locally about, well, I just wanted to go to the bar, or whatever it may be. And also, they may say, well, she was very upset because I did cheat on her. That's not the same as this crazy guy that's so jealous for no reason.
Right. You sort of talk about it in two different ways. I mean, the one thing is that these notions of power and control are abstract and maybe difficult for them to understand at the prevention intervention level, but then also that it doesn't resonate with the experience of the majority of people in these relationships.
Right. Yeah. I think those are both, that's an accurate way to nicely depict that.
So then, okay, tomorrow you're presenting some work on desistance from IPV, which is interesting because you've done quite a bit of work on desistance from crime and delinquency in general. So how would you say this is different or maybe similar to that process?
Yeah, so this has been an interesting development because it enables me to take two different things and try to integrate them. So I have the intimate partner violence interest, and then I have the old back there is my desistance interest. And so we began to look at these patterns across 5 waves of data. And so even though the literature or conventional wisdom says that, once an abuser, always an abuser, that basically is just not true. And a lot of desistance occurs within a given relationship, and a lot of desistance occurs probably even more across relationships. And there is a developmental process, and so we see that the peak is around age in the early 20s, and then it starts to decline. And so we have the advantage, maybe it's somewhat of an advantage, that we're looking at the process of desistance right while that decrease is happening as they're moving into their later 20s. And so we actually set out for interviewing people that reflected different patterns of persistence and desistance. And I do feel that it's a worthwhile, I guess, a kind of a theme of that work is that it is somewhat unique. There are unique features. And I guess as we started to do the study, the idea would be, well, is this just like garden variety desistance? Are the same sort of things we've been talking about over in that literature, just push them over in here and that'll work. And so our point is that isn't exactly a seamless process either. There are some unique features. And so the fun thing there is that goes against some recent work. For example, Felsen and Lane have a piece where they say, is there anything special about IPV? And their answer is no, there isn't anything special about IPV. And so on one hand, I understand what their point, and I think that is right in the sense that some of the standard predictors of IPV are the standard predictors of crime. And so you could use kind of your general toolkit for explaining one or explaining the other. But the limitation of that view is it's kind of a don't ask, don't tell problem, because if they haven't asked about relationship-specific risks, then they're not getting the entire story of how onset happens, how continuation happens, and how desistance happens, because the relationship piece of it is very critical. And in terms of that kind of a design where you just have a potpourri of different offenders, you really couldn't ask a relationship specific factors of some guy who's doing another completely different type of crime. And so there's almost an inherent sort of limit on that. And so we do find, for example, that there is a redefinition process. I think it's fair to talk about cognitive transformations or changes in how you feel about these things, and wanting to make a change and all the rest that's been talked about in that other literature. But there are unique elements. So, for example, when people talk about stopping intimate partner violence, they don't just talk about hitting. And so, again, with the one-for-one idea, you would think they've come to see that violence is really inappropriate, and it's bad for the relationship. And so it would be all this discourse around violence. But actually, a lot of it is about the pathways to escalating conflicts. And so some of them will say, following along on this emphasis on infidelity, is they will say, I learned how not to cheat on my partner. I learned what she went through when that happened. I wouldn't want that to happen to me. And so the redefinition process has to do with that, and not so much, hitting your partner is inappropriate, right, which is kind of the bottom line, the end point. Everybody knows that anyway. And so it's, and the same with sort of a lot of the young people that we interviewed talked about communication changes. And so that's something that they know, that even maybe that's specific to a particular partner, that I learned that when I bring up these certain situations, this is going to fuel the flames, and I've just calmed down since that whole thing. I don't have to bring these things up. And they do have what we call this relationship learning curve, and it doesn't seem to be exactly the same as what a criminal desistance narrative looks like. And so, for example, you might have some elements of criminal desistance narrative that are absent. So a lot of crime narratives will have to do with, I needed to get away from all my bad companions. And, that's part of it. I got to stay away from all those guys. Whereas that's just not as relevant in this particular case when things are happening within the home.
Right.
And so you have to be able to deal with it. And I think we talk about how all IPV desistance is local, that is worked out on a daily basis at the relationship level. And so, we do think there are some unique aspects of it. So in a very small way, I think this contributes to making a little bit of a challenge to the generality of deviance argument, which is basically that all crime, you do one, you do the other, a generic bread and butter factors are going to be fine. And then the other part of that is that, as Fagan said in 1989, he said that factors related to onset may be irrelevant to cessation, or words to that effect. And I love that. I think that's such a neat point, and in a certain way, that was an anchor for this new theory, this new idea of pursuing desistance, because it says, well, we can't lean on these old variables that we sort of rehash to death. We need new frameworks and so on. And I think that has been replayed a lot. But I think through doing this study that I would revise that, and I would say that if you actually even follow some of those other things, there are threads connecting things. And I illustrated that with the idea of, infidelity in, no infidelity out. And so if you think about it, some of the things that people have said about, well, like if you take Sampson and Lobb's work, that in a way they're talking about how the love and attachment of a caring spouse takes the place of the lack of attachment that you experienced in your early home. But they're kind of connected, because they're saying you are capable of change and you are capable of growing when you get that from a loving spouse. And so, but there is that thread that connects the two. So maybe we've overstated how different these areas of study
the
are.
Onset versus
the onset versus the desistance. So those are two elements, because ultimately I like to think about, are there any more general implications as well as the IPV
specific?
Yeah, yeah.
So from these different bodies of work, is there something that you're most proud of, or you think that makes the largest contribution to the field?
Well, I think at the time, the most cited paper probably is the cognitive transformation paper, because at the time, that was a little bit of a counterpoint to sort of an event-based view of, going through the transition events is going to make you desist or be critical to desistance. And so, but I feel that there's a lot of other people that were independently saying very compatible things, like Shad Maruna and the people over in, some of the British scholars had a lot of very compatible work on agency and the like. And so ultimately, we were doing that work somewhat separately, but it all kind of converged into thinking about those internal social psychological changes and how those made a difference. But I think that is something that I'm a bit proud of. One of the thoughts I have about that study is that it was called Gender, Crime, and Desistance toward a Theory of Cognitive Transformation. And so the simplest way to proceed in having done that study was to basically say, this is the way women do desistance, and this is, a contrast to the way men do desistance. And that was really what my job was, and I knew that was my job, but I just couldn't do it quite like that, because I did feel that some of these, very basic kinds of things were interesting about cognitive processes, and I hadn't really thought that much about cognitive processes myself, because I am, as I said, more the knee-jerk social learning person who thinks the group does it all to me, and I'm influenced by my group. And here they were having these cognitive shifts, and I thought that was generally interesting, and I thought it actually was occurring for women and it was occurring for men, and they talked about it in very similar ways. And so I think one of the fun things is to consider that we often don't ever use women's samples to make a general point. And why is that? I don't know. But I'm kind of proud that I had a sample of women that were making a general point. And why shouldn't they? Why do we have to have men make the general point and women only make the point about some unique feature of their lives that
Right.
is distinctively different? But that's kind of the paradigm that we have. And so I think even in the IPV work, sometimes the women are a little bit more eloquent, and they go into more detail about their feelings of anger and so on that they have, and it's a little bit more socially acceptable for them to talk about it. And so I have a feeling that we're getting some of the attitudes and things that men may have that they're not as likely to express, because it's very discrediting for them to do so.
Mm-hmm.
And so I like that idea that women can stand in for a general process, and I'm going to keep trying to do that.
Right. Well, if so many of you've highlighted another work that the processes are largely similar, maybe some pathways are unique, but it would make sense to be able to focus on the women as well.
Yes.
All right. So what about going back to that same article? Maybe you could talk a little bit about some of the criticism that you've endured, or maybe hoops you've jumped through in publication processes and things like that.
Sure. So that was an interesting process of moving through that to the point of publication. And so I think it's maybe a good story for young people, because I submitted that paper to the American Journal of Sociology, which is a difficult journal to get in, but I did do that, and it went through a round of review, and then it went through a second round of review, and it was rejected. And so, as you know, it was actually published in there. So what's up with that? So at the second round of review, somebody said that I should just take that theory of cognitive transformation and throw it in the trash, and that even it actually said something about empirical research is really worthless as well. And I certainly don't even think of myself, I had this sad little model in there that was so babyish and simple, but that was not good, and the whole thing should be thrown in the trash. And so then I got my rejection letter. So good times. So I protested that rejection and sent a nice long, tortured letter to the editor, and they actually sent it to an arbiter, which is a neat thing. And I don't know if all journals have that, but this one did, and it took a while and so on. And so the arbiter came back and said, this was a mistake to reject this, and it has value and so on. And so then they accepted it almost wholesale with no more changes. And the thing is actually really long. It's so long nobody wants to read it. It's just ridiculously long, but at that point I'm like, yes, and so that got in there, and but that was a painful process. But it does show you that sometimes I'm always trying to get young faculty to protest. It doesn't always work. And I've tried it again and it doesn't work. But that particular time it did. And so it was all's well that ends well in that one. But yeah, it's not always easy.
Have you had to deal with any other criticism about your work specifically, or?
Well, I tend to think that nobody cares about it enough to criticize it. But let's see. So it would be mostly at the point of getting reviews. I think that's where you do some of these new papers on intimate partner violence. This is a field where things are very keenly felt, and you do have people coming at it from different points in the system, like where they've dealt mostly with clinic samples or shelter samples or criminal justice samples. And we do realize that we have only a community sample that we're working with. But that's been a challenge to try to navigate that terrain and to present things in the complexity that we feel is there, while respecting these views. Right. So that's been somewhat of a challenge, but it's working out. It's working out okay. So
slowly but surely.
Slowly but surely, there is some hope at the end of the tunnel on that.
So with your really extensive grant activity, you've been an advisor or overseen a number of students, you've mentored a number of students, and so we've benefited from your advice. But what sort of advice would you give to young scholars?
Okay, well, one thought I had was that as you move into your program in your graduate career, when I first started out as a young faculty member and people would come to me with their ideas, I thought that I had to just do whatever they said in terms of their idea, that they had an interest in serial killers or something, so I would have to mentor them even though I didn't know anything about it and everything. But that was their love, and I had to just support them in their way. And so sort of the older view is that, and that would be the advice, is that as you're working with these people at your school, you need to take their advice, because you may not have that broader sense of what needs to be done. This particular area has maybe been done to death, and those profs they know that at a different level than you know that. Mm-hmm. And I also think that life is short, and so don't pick projects that aren't about something consequential, that is really about human problems or core issues or things like that. So I know I had a young woman come and say that she wanted to do some work on S&M clubs for her master's thesis and stuff, which is good. She probably could have really done an excellent job on group dynamics or whatever it may be, but mm-hmm. I just think, okay, not so sure that's the best approach. And so those faculty members, at least at least give them 2 areas and let them choose or whatever. And plus, there's just more likely to be resources. There's more likely to be excitement on the part of those profs if they're invested in that particular area. So I think that's something that I really have gotten more pushy about over time, is let's have it on something that really matters and that it's really a good question.
Right. Well, you've given me similar advice where people have their pet interests and you have the rest of your career to do that. So latch on to these scholars in your department while you're there, right?
Right.
So that's
pet thing
right.
A bit later
in life.
Yes.
What about just general thoughts on the state of the field and maybe some questions that should be explored or different angles that people should try to work towards in the future?
Yeah, so that's kind of hard. General questions, like general question on the prelims, where's the field headed? I always hated that. But I think, well, in my own area, which is social learning area, I think there's a lot that can be done in social learning, and it's almost crazy in a way that we have progressed so little in a number of areas of understanding. We think that there is a transmission of different attitudes, but our measurement of these attitudes is very primitive, so that we know that marijuana users have pro attitudes toward use of marijuana. It's just so basic. And so in the IPV world is another example of that, where some of the original ideas about attitudes supporting IPV are like, it's okay to hit your partner. Something, that gets extremely low rates of endorsement because it's so global. And it's like, nobody believes that anymore. Everybody knows it's bad to hit your partner. And yet here we still have all of these people that are hitting their partner. And I personally don't think it all has to do with low self-control or something like that. I think there are attitudes that are supporting this, that if you dig deeper and get more specific, there are things that are still out there that are held beliefs that they can articulate, and it's our job to get those, because those are the things that in terms of prevention you need to target. Because just to say it's unhealthy to hit your partner or something, we already know that. Right. And it's these more subtle, nuanced kinds of things that we need to ferret out. And I just, certainly hitting back is still a lot more accepted than the initial hitting, which everyone knows is bad. But hitting back, there's still even some men in our sample that are fairly strong about that. Right. So you can't say that they just flew off the handle and they never thought about it, or they're just, have low self-control or whatever it is. That they have developed ideas that, you get too close to me, you hit me like a man, and you're going to get hit back like a man. We have quotes like that, and so that's an area that I think we need to work on. And again, as I said, that we may need to step back from things that are directly relevant to the outcome that we're interested in, to talk about the broader life space within a family. And the family is a lot, giving all these attitudes out all the time. I know I was on a review panel recently, and they were talking about a family study, and they were studying the dynamics of support and control. And it was like support and control. And I said, well, there's more to the family than support and control. And one of the other reviewers said, what? Well, what would there be other than support and control? And so that would be, the whole universe of what is communicated daily about all features of your life. And that is a kind of, again, a more of a social learning frame, that it's not just a lack of supervision, and it's not just the presence or absence of warmth or attachment, which are core building blocks of, positive functioning. But I don't think that whole other arena has been tapped in the way that it actually could be with respect to a lot of different focused problems. And so that's one area, but that just kind of comes on the heels of that tradition that I think I'm coming out of. And another thing I think, as I am sort of a late career person, is that link between policy and the basic research. And everybody says that, but I feel it more keenly now. I think probably because of this intimate partner violence work, that you see things that actually are wrong, that are literally on websites, and they're not factually accurate statements.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think some of our findings could be the basis for a prevention program, for example, but I wouldn't have the first idea how to go about doing that. I would be completely ignorant about building a prevention program, and it's kind of late in the game for that for me.
Mm-hmm.
But there are things out there that I think there are some agencies that are actively trying, like the WT Grant Foundation has a program where they try to get people who have been in one to get more savvy about the other. So the policy people to do the more research, and the reverse, to get people more where they're savvy on policy and have a way to get in there and maybe influence policy directions in a more direct manner. That's something we all need to do. Now, not every project is as amenable to that, and there's probably some that don't, and that's okay too, because we are basic researchers for the most part. But ultimately, you do want to make a difference.
Right.
So.